Well, has that day come when I am finally retiring my old film scanners? Now, over the years I have had much success in digitising my images 35mm, 120 and large format using dedicated film scanners, but technology changes and things move on, and I'm now of the opinion that there are better ways of getting your images into the computer. The equipment I've typically used in the past 20 years has been an Epson V750, which has been around for about 20 odd years now, and also dedicated 35mm scanners such as the Coolscan from Nikon, the Coolscan 5, and the Minolta 5400 Elite, both very, very high resolution devices capable of extracting just about every bit of information from those smaller negatives. But I have started to notice over the years that the performance is perhaps not all it could be, and part of that stems from the fact that the technology for scanners largely ground to a halt over 20 years ago with the onslaught of digital cameras, because obviously you have to sell your products, and if you're a manufacturer and you were selling boatloads of film scanners in the 90s, it's a profitable business. But come these days, and probably about 2005 onwards, very few people were buying film cameras, so equally people didn't want to digitise their images quite as much. They would go and buy a Canon EOS or a Nikon D-series DSLR and get far better results. So what we have is a stagnant technology. Now, the best results will come from the likes of drum scanners, a very specialised, very large pieces of equipment, usually shackled to ancient Apple Macs running SCSI interfaces, for those who can remember those, and they're really out of the range of most people. They're very specialised. So typically I've been using sort of mid-range flatbeds like the V750 to get acceptable results from typically 120 film and 4x5, but perhaps not very good quality results from 35mm film. Now, in the past 10-15 years or so, there has been a great deal of interest in using your digital camera to digitise your images, largely because the sensor technology has improved so much that it has outstripped that of the traditional dedicated film scanner, to the point where people can get superb quality results using the same camera that they may go out and shoot the landscape or portraits with. They just put it on a stand and actually point it at the film. Alright, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you get the picture. So I've decided to break this down into four main areas where I consider scanning to be important. And the first one is the speed, how long it takes to actually digitise the image. Now, if I'm using a flatbed scanner, that can be reasonably quick, because I could put maybe 24 35mm frames in there, or 12 potentially medium format frames, and just let the scanner get on with it, so I'm not having to attend to it. Now, that can take anything from maybe 20 minutes to an hour, at which point I have a reasonably good negative or positive to work from. The second thing I'm really interested in is the resolution, how much detail can be extracted from those negatives or positives. Now, the flatbed scanners have severe limitations in this respect. It's been talked about for many, many years. They can extract a reasonable amount of detail at fairly low contrast, but you will need to do quite a bit of post-processing in your favourite editing tool to extract more detail, sharpening, contrast, clarity, etc. And whilst I consider it acceptable at medium format and definitely at large format, it is left wanting at 35mm, and it's always been below par for my liking. Now, the next thing is convenience. How convenient is it for me to set up the scanner and digitise the images? Now, with the flatbed, it's relatively straightforward. You put the cut strips of film into the holders and you let it get on with it. When I'm using a dedicated film scanner, though, it can be a bit more painful. Every 6 frames or so in 35mm, having to put it into the dedicated holder and feed it in while it chugs away. It can take maybe 5-10 minutes or more, depending on resolution, to digitise each strip of 6. So that can take you quite a long time, and it ties you up while you're sat there feeding the thing in and waiting for it to finish. And the final point is, what added features does a film scanner give me? Well, perhaps the biggest one for me would be the infrared cleanup feature that many scanners feature, like my Epson V750, my earlier Nikon Coolscan 5, and also the Minolta 5400 Elite. Now, they have a feature whereby they do a final pass of the positive or negative using an infrared light. Now, that will identify dust spots on the negative, and via the use of clever software, it actually applies fixes automatically to your negative or positive. So it removes those dust spots or scratches or blemishes before you even get it into Lightroom, which can save you a huge amount of time if you've got very, very messy negs and positives. Now, there is obviously the move towards digital cameras, and to that end I have been dabbling for probably 5 or more years with digital cameras as scanning devices, half-heartedly at first, but much more seriously in the past year. Now, going through those 4 criteria I judge by, again, speed. Now, if I have an uncut strip of 35mm film or 120 film, it is extremely quick for me with my modern digital camera scanning technique to feed those through and snap away at them. It might take me as little as 5 minutes to do a whole strip of film, at which point I can then move on to the post-processing. So speed for me is a huge win. Now, looking at the quality, I have noticed in recent years that the quality of scans I can get from my digital camera setup with a macro lens is as good, if not better, than the dedicated film scanners. Certainly better than the medium format scans I can get from the flatbed, and far, far better than the 35mm scans from the flatbed. When it comes to dedicated 35mm scanners like the Cool Scans and the Minolta Elites, it's pretty close, but I would say it's getting to the point where it's not that relevant. The digital camera is, for my eyes, as good as the dedicated scanner. Now, convenience. Now, when I was half-heartedly dabbling with camera scanning, I was messing about with cheap holders which came from, I think they came from Lomography, and I had to have them in cut strips, and it was a bit of a faff to get them flat and get them underneath the camera. I used to spend a lot of time messing about, and there was a lot of frustration, so I found that actually less convenient than the film scanners themselves, the dedicated scanners. However, since I've upgraded to what's this thing? It's a Valoy system. I'm not going to go into it in detail here, and I'm not sponsored, and it's all my own money which buys these things. Since I've upgraded to that, I have found feeding a whole uncut strip of 35mm or 120 an absolute breeze, and I can get through them so quickly now that I actually prefer setting that up to a dedicated scanner. Now, the last point in terms of extra features, there are no extra features for me with my digital camera setup. I haven't got infrared cleaning, so if I've got a messy negative, it's going to take me ages in Lightroom or Photoshop to clean it up. I mean, AI and smart fixes are getting easier and easier to apply, but typically if you go for a cleanup of a very dirty negative, you set it to automatic, it's going to take a lot of the quality out of it as it tries to smooth over those blemishes, or you're sat there spotting for minutes or hours, in which case if you've got a lot of very tatty negatives or positives, I think a dedicated film scanner may be the best direction to go in. So the situation I find myself in now is that I have been using a dedicated holder and doing digital camera scanning exclusively for just over a year, which is why I didn't want to make this video earlier, because I don't want to say this is the way to go, you should do this with little experience. But my experience of using the dedicated holder from Valoy and using a good digital camera, I use a Micro Four Thirds. Typically I'll use that in high res mode if I'm digitizing medium format, or standard res mode if I'm just using 35mm negatives, because 20 megapixel digital camera is going to extract just about everything you can get in 35mm. And I've really enjoyed using that. It has been so much easier. I can just feed the strip of negatives in once I've developed them, click away with the camera, and then get them into Lightroom for me. And I use Negative Lab Pro to do the inversion. Not so much of a problem for black and white, a little bit more faffing with colour, but really quite easy. And yeah, I have become a complete convert to this method. Now, that doesn't mean to say there aren't use cases where I would still consider using a dedicated film scanner. Now, the obvious one for me is large format, which I do very little of these days. Circumstances are conspiring against me to do mainly the smaller formats at the moment. But I would say if I was digitizing a reasonable number of 4x5 negatives, whether colour or black and white, I would still use the Epson V750 because it makes a superb job of those large negatives. The drawbacks aren't so severe with such a large negative or positive, and the digital cleanup is there if I'm doing C41 colour films. Plus, it's very easy to set 2 of these things up and let them sit there scanning. When I'm doing it with the digital camera, I have to use it on high-res mode, or I have to stitch multiple images together, which takes a lot longer than actually setting up the V750, and I don't need the extreme quality that the small Micro Four Thirds camera will give me over the flatbed. And as I said earlier, the advantage of a flatbed with something like digital correction, the infrared correction, would be if you had a pile of old negatives or positives from a family member or a relative, And I have done this, by the way. I have had dozens of old slides given to me 15, 20 years ago, and I set them up with the scanner and I put them into automatic clean mode, and it sat there for ages scanning away, but it was quite remarkable just what a good job it did of the fungus, the scratches and all the little bits of dust on those old slides. It would have taken me forever if I'd have been doing it with the digital camera, so I can still see use cases for the dedicated scanner. But for me going forward, I am quite happy with the setup I have with this Valoy tool and my digital camera. It's just become so convenient. The quality is superb. I'm getting all the detail I want out of it. I can't really want for more. I think it extracts just about all the detail there is in the image. And by the way, I did try using a full frame digital camera, a 36 megapixel Nikon D810 with a macro lens, and it didn't actually look as good to my eye as the Micro Four Thirds. I mean, maybe that's down to the quality of the lens. I use a superb 30mm macro on my Micro Four Thirds. Also, you've got massively more depth of field, so any little ripples in the negative, if there are any, which you don't really get with this holder, are taken care of by the extra depth of field over full frame. So I see no advantage personally to using anything more than the Micro Four Thirds camera as it stands at the moment. So there you go, my scanners are boxed up. They are sat in a cupboard. They have not been sold off, because you never know. I may decide to do something with them. Certainly the flatbed for the larger formats, I could see that possibly being used in the future. But for now, I'm totally happy with the digital camera approach. So yes, I have retired my film scanners. I'd just like to thank them here for 20 years of loyal service and cranking out excellent images. But time moves on, and I'm going to make use of the new tools we have to get the best out of my film photography. So I hope that was useful, and thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.